Hey everyone, I'm Belle Reid and welcome back. Today I'm taking a look at the intuitive Instruments Exquis MIDI controller. I've teamed up with Perfect Circuit and Intuitive Instruments to do a giveaway of an Exquis, so you can head to the link below for details on how to enter. The Exquis is an MPE-capable MIDI and CV controller, which means you can use it as a controller for your computer, hardware synthesizers, modular synths, and more. And unlike more typical MIDI controllers, the Exquis provides a lot more potential for independent per-note expressive control, which is something we're going to talk a lot more about in just a minute. When researching the Exquis, I found that most of the videos out there are focused toward beginners in music making and lean toward a more traditional style of music, using the Exquis with a companion app to create layered loops and beats. In this video today, however, I want to focus on using the Exquis as a controller for hardware instruments specifically, because at its core, it's a flexible controller that can be mapped and used in many different ways. All right, so understanding Exquis in general is aided in large part by understanding MPE. So I'll first do an overview of what MPE is and how it works, and then we'll take a look at a bunch of different examples using Exquis in context. MPE stands for MIDI Polyphonic Expression. In a nutshell, MPE expands standard MIDI by allowing you to control certain aspects of a sound, like for example, pitch bend and timbre, polyphonically. In standard MIDI, all MIDI information, including pitch bend, MIDI CCs, and note information, are sent on a single channel. So, for example, if you're playing a chord on your synthesizer and you send pitch bend information, the pitch bend information will impact all of the notes in your chord at the same time. What MPE lets you do is expand this control and send MIDI information on a different unique channel for each key press. So for example, if you're playing your cluster of notes, you can send different pitch bend information to each note in your chord. Now, of course, this doesn't just have to be used with pitch bend information. MPE can actually let you control any aspect of a sound's timbre. And something that's really cool is that you can use a single gesture to send multiple different control messages out to different aspects of a sound. So typically, each parameter of sound would be mapped on your MIDI controller to a different specific part of the controller. Your filter cutoff might be controlled by one knob, for example, and the release time of your envelope might be controlled by another knob or slider, and so on. An MPE controller like Exquis allows you to combine multiple controls into a single physical gesture. So for example, on Exquis, when you press down on a key, you can simultaneously send X, Y, and pressure information. Those three aspects of this one gesture can be used to control three independent aspects of the sound's timbre. The Exquis controller uses an isomorphic layout for the keyboard. The idea is that because the keys are laid out in a two-dimensional grid, you can create note layouts where the same physical patterns will correspond to the same musical intervals on the keyboard. For example, major thirds are arranged like this. So anywhere on the keyboard that you play this shape will result in a major third. Adjacent keys in a single row are chromatic, so by extension, a minor third is this shape. So that also means that common chord qualities will have consistent shapes across the entire instrument. So if you're not already familiar with standard black and white keyboard layouts, this can be a bit more intuitive because the same tonal colors are the same shapes, no matter where you are on the keyboard. Now, of course, these kind of controller layouts aren't just intended for people who don't have a familiarity with typical keyboards. Any kind of controller with a unique layout can lead you to musical ideas and ways of interacting with sound that you might not otherwise explore with a different musical interface, which in my opinion is really awesome. All right, so you've probably noticed that there are a lot of illuminated keys. These light up in accordance to your root note and scale settings. You can change the root note by holding down this setting button and turning the second encoder. And you can change the scale by holding down the settings button and changing the third encoder. You can also change the overall brightness of the keys using the fourth encoder. It's important to note here that changing the scale and the root note doesn't reconfigure the keyboard's note mapping. It's simply a visual guide that shows you what notes are in the selected scale and where the tonic is. This can be helpful for getting started or if you're specifically playing in a tonal style. But I definitely would encourage you to also play outside the lines because there's a lot to discover. These two buttons here are octave keys. The other buttons here and this touch strip correspond largely with features of the app that Intuitive Instruments made to pair with the controller. But the app is not required to use the controller itself, and I'm not going to be covering it in this video. When you're using the Exquis as a standalone controller like we are here, these buttons and encoders also send out MIDI CCs. It's also helpful to know that you can change the interval spacing between each hexagonal key if you want to, so that the patterns can be arranged differently. As I mentioned earlier, the point of an MPE controller is that you have many different dimensions of control from each element that you make physical contact with. So instead of using knobs or sliders or pitch bend wheels to play expressively, you can instead use the way that you're touching the controller to alter many different parameters of sound. Each one of these hexagonal keys produces X, Y, and Z data. X is mapped to pitch bend, Y sends out CC74, and Z, or pressure, is aftertouch. Now, I've used a lot of different MIDI controllers, and the responsiveness of the Exquis is really nice. Even just very gentle pressure on the keys is really responsive, which means that you can have a wide range of interaction and expressiveness. When I first got the Exquis, my immediate thought was that the keys felt weirdly squishy and soft. But after using it for a while, I've actually realized that having that physical depth that you can press into and the extra resistance that that provides is actually really helpful. It provides a really nice haptic response. There's also an app and some preset sounds that you can download to use alongside the Exquis controller. But again, I'm not talking in depth about the app today. Okay, so now that we have a lay of the land here, let's take a look at some demos of how we can use Exquis in combination with different hardware synthesizers. Now, it's important to note that in order to take advantage of the MPE functionality of Exquis, we need to make sure that we're using MPE-capable synthesizers. Even just a few years ago, there really weren't that many hardware instruments that could receive MPE data, but happily, that has changed now. So I'm going to be using a couple of my favorites, and I'll show you some unconventional uses for Exquis and MPE in general. So in this demo, I'm using Exquis with the Black Corporation Kijimi, which is an 8-voice analog synthesizer based on the RSF Poly Cobol. I have the X and Y positions from Exquis mapped to pitch bend and also the cutoff frequency on the filter over on Kijimi. And then I'm mapping Z or pressure to control the rate of LFO2, and that is being used to modulate the cutoff frequency of the filter as well. I also noticed something pretty random and crazy with Kijimi. This is a very weird coincidence, but I noticed that this button here on Exquis is set up to send out MIDI CC31. And on Kijimi, MIDI CC31 just so happens to randomize the synth's parameters. So with a single button press, I'm able to completely transform the patch on the synth and get into new sonic territory, which is pretty awesome. So I have no idea what this is actually going to sound like, but let's find out. Yeah. For the next few demos, I'm going to be using the ASM Hydrasynth. Now, these keys on the Hydrasynth might look similar to what's going on here on the Exquis, and they are in a sense, but these keys are only sensitive to velocity and pressure. So they don't have the X, Y input control like Exquis does. That said, the Hydrasynth itself is set up to receive MPE control. One really cool thing about the Hydrasynth is that it handles MPE directly in its modulation matrix, which means that the routing for MPE data is super flexible and can be used to impact any of the synth's modulatable parameters. So in this patch, I'm using the pressure, the Z-axis, to modulate a parameter on Hydrasynth that's called wave scan, which is essentially going to interpolate between a bunch of different waveforms on the Hydrasynth. And then I'm using the X and Y axes to modulate pitch bend and FM depth, respectively. So here is a microtonal patch on the Hydrasynth where each key press creates a kind of peculiar harmony with a low note and a couple of high notes. But if you hold a key down, you'll get a solo voice that comes out of the texture, which is sensitive to X and Y position. This patch is a chaotic feedback-based patch on the Hydrasynth where I'm modulating a whole ton of different parameters. And because Exquis is so sensitive, and because it puts so many keys in such a small surface area, to play this patch, you can very gently just rest your hand on it and get to all kinds of really interesting different kinds of gestures. Here's an interesting trick you can try with a multi-timbral sound module. Now, I've only personally tried this so far with the Digitone 2, so your mileage may vary a bit, but it's worth giving it a shot. If you remember our discussion earlier, the way that MPE works is by sending each note successively on a new MIDI channel. That's what enables us to get independent pitch bend, CCs, etc. sent to each individual note. So, typical MPE-capable synthesizers are designed in such a way that each of their voices can use the same sound settings, but listen on different MIDI channels. Now, this idea has some potentially weird implications, though, for multi-timbral instruments. Since many multi-timbral instruments are designed in such a way that each independent timbre can listen to a different MIDI channel, the uses with MPE controllers can get pretty weird. Here, for instance, I'm using a project that I made for a recent video about the Digitone 2, in which I demonstrated the idea of using the trig keys as a multi-timbral playing interface. But when I use the X key to control it, instead of having just one key correspond to a specific sound, the data gets dynamically allocated to different channels, depending on how I play, how many notes I'm playing at once, how long I hold them down, and so on. So this means that I can basically just mash around on the X key and wind up with some really interesting and dynamic results. And naturally, this kind of exploratory playing also promotes the use of some extended techniques. In addition to being a MIDI controller, the Exquis also has CV outputs, so you can use it directly with any Eurorack or semi-modular gear without needing a MIDI to CV converter, which is really cool. There's a CV output here for pitch, gate, and mod, which is derived from the key aftertouch. The pitch CV output is a combined note CV and pitch bend CV, which tracks volt per octave. So here in this patch, I'm using the Make Noise Strega, which is a small semi-modular synthesizer. I'm running the pitch output from Exquis into the volt per octave input on Strega. The gate output is being used to trigger the envelope on Strega, and in turn, the envelope is activating the oscillator here, which basically turns the volume up on the oscillator. And then finally, I'm using the mod CV output to modulate the delay time. But of course, just because these outputs are labeled pitch, gate, and mod doesn't mean you have to use them for those parameters. So for example, in this patch, I'm running the pitch CV output into the absorb input on Strega. I'm using the gate output to modulate the blend parameter on Strega, which blends between the dry oscillator tone and the oscillator processed through the delay and filter. And I'm using the mod output to modulate the speed of the envelope. All right, so for me personally, controllers play a really big role in my music making and composition practice. And I'll often play the same instrument or even the same patch with multiple different control interfaces depending on the project. I find that changing up the controller can have a very significant impact on the overall instrument itself. And it can really encourage you to think about how you're interacting with the sound in new ways, and it can also maybe push you out of your comfort zone and away from ingrained habits. I love the fact that Exquis is so small and relatively affordable compared to some other MPE controllers that are currently on the market. And the built-in CV outputs make it super easy to connect to any Eurorack modular or semi-modular gear, which is great. Just a reminder that I'm partnering with Perfect Circuit and Intuitive Instruments for a giveaway of an Exquis controller. So if you'd like to enter, you can head to the link below. Also in the description below this video is an affiliate link if you'd like to pick up an Exquis for yourself. And anything that you buy using that link helps to support my channel at no extra cost to you, so I can continue making videos like this one. And finally, if you are interested in joining a community of amazing people who are passionate about things like experimental music, modular synthesizers, and sound design, or if you're interested in things like behind the scenes content and unreleased audio, then I would love to invite you to check out and possibly join my Patreon community. You can learn more about it by going to patreon.com/SarahBelleReid. All right, that's all for today. As always, thank you so much for watching and for listening, and I'll see you next time. That was a cool little trick at the end. Whoops. I ought to face the camera bits. I've teamed up with Perfect Circuits and Perfect Circuits. Glam, glam, glam. Blup. I need lunch.